introduce myself. I'm Barış Salihoğlu. I'm the director of METU's Center for Climate Change and Sustainable Development, as well as the Marine Science Institute. And I'm also assistant to the rector on sustainability and climate, advisor to the rector on sustainability and climate issues. And I'm responsible of organizing COP31 contribution of METUs, and I'm part of the organizing committee, the National Organizing Committee of the Ministry and the Higher Education Council. So today's seminar is extremely exciting, and I'm very excited to have this audience and our very valuable speakers here. Just briefly, we started our webinar series early this month with a session on COP's past and future. And our second webinar now is on energy transition. And it consists of two sessions, and one today and one will be on Friday. And both sessions will host world-renowned experts in the field. And again, I'm thankful to all our speakers who made the time today. I'm sure their time is extremely precious, and they will share their expertise with us ahead of COP31, which will be held in Antalya, Turkey. And I would like to briefly mention our speakers in alphabetical order. So first, Mr. Gürbüz Gönül. He represents the International Renewable Energy Agency, and he joined IRENA in 2014, and he has been serving as the Director of Country Engagement and Partnership since 2019. He previously worked as Senior Energy Economist at the Islamic Development Bank, Senior Expert at the Energy Charter Secretariat, Sector Manager at the European Commission Delegation in Turkey, in addition to taking on various roles at the Turkish Ministry of Energy and Natural Resources. And we have one thing in common: we both graduated from METU Petroleum Engineering Department. So I would like to welcome Mr. Gönül, and it's great to have you here. And I would like to introduce Professor Peter Newell, who is a Professor of International Relations at the University of Sussex, Research Director and co-founder of the Rapid Transition Alliance, and Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. He has also served on the board of directors for Greenpeace UK and Carbon Market Watch. He specializes in the political economy of climate change and energy transitions. He has been tracking climate negotiations for over 30 years, focusing on the political economy of fossil fuel phase-outs. And he has many awards, as you can see on the panel here. So I will not go by one, but I would like to thank him for joining us today. It's a real great pleasure. And last, but definitely not the least, Prof. Johan Rockström, who is the director of Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and professor in Earth System Science at the University of Potsdam. And he has previously served as the co-founder and executive director of Stockholm Resilience Center, the executive director of the Stockholm Environmental Institute, and the chief scientist at Conservation International. And he had led the team that created the Planetary Boundaries Framework, defining the 9 safe operating limits for humanity on Earth, and which also touched my research very strongly, because one of the projects that I have been coordinating, the Bridge Black Sea project, was based on this concept. And we have studied the planetary boundaries in the marine system in the Black Sea. And we also worked with the Stockholm Resilience Institute here and did some resilience analysis in the marine environment. So, of course, all our presenters today are very valuable, but I, in a way, followed very closely the publications of Professor Rockström. And he is a key scientific voice at COPs as well, and presenting regular updates on global climate tipping points and planetary boundaries. and I would like to welcome him, and we are very honored to have you here. Just a few logistical issues about the format today. As in our first webinar, we have 3 panelists, and we'll pose 3 rounds of questions at each speaker. And each speaker will have 3 minutes to answer each question. And our viewers can type in their questions in the Zoom chat. Please do that. And I will then try to choose the most relevant ones. And I may merge a few of them sometimes as well. So let's get started with our panel because we are trying to fit in 1 hour. So I will start with Professor Rockström. And before I start on discussing on energy transition, I would like to open with a question on the overall outlook on where our planet is headed today. Professor Rockström, you have developed the notion of planetary boundaries, as I have mentioned, and have been warning the global audience about the risk of crossing certain thresholds. So in your opinion, where are we today in terms of these thresholds, and how close are we in reaching certain tipping points where Earth system transition from carbon sinks to active carbon sources can occur? Please, Professor Rockström.
Yeah, thanks, Barış, and great to be with you. And well, the scientific evidence is very clear. In the latest Planetary Boundary Science update, which we released as recently as in October 2025, 7 of the 9 Earth system processes behind the planetary boundaries that regulates, which we have scientific evidence for, regulates the stability, the resilience, and the life support on planet Earth, they are breached. And this tells us something really important also for the climate transition, that among these 7 breached boundaries, you of course have the climate boundary. We're now at 1.4 degrees Celsius of global mean surface temperature rise, but we're also inevitably moving towards overshoot, kicking through the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit, very likely already within the next 5 to 10 years. But the drama is worse than that, because when you're putting so much heat and instability and stress into the Earth system, you would at least want to have a resilient planet to buffer that stress. But unfortunately, we're breaching the biosphere boundaries of biodiversity loss, land system change, overconsumption of fresh water, overloading of biogeochemical flows, that is nitrogen, reactive nitrogen, and phosphorus, basically from agriculture predominantly, and destabilizing the ocean's life support system through ocean acidification. So we're doing a double mistake here. We are forcing the climate system and the Earth's energy imbalance through fossil fuel emissions and greenhouse gas emissions, and undermining the ability of the Earth system to buffer that pressure. Are we seeing evidence of this breaching translating into risks of destabilizing the functioning of the Earth system? I would argue that the answer is yes, within a wide range of uncertainty. We've mapped 16 climate tipping element systems, which means systems that have evidence of multiple stable states and tipping points if you push them too far. Among these 16, which contribute to regulate the stability of the climate system, 6 of them are at risk of crossing their tipping points, meaning irreversible transitions from a state that cools and dampens the planet to a self-amplifying state that would undermine life support, that they are likely to cross the thresholds already at a permanent transition, breaching of 1.5 degrees Celsius. And here you have the Greenland ice sheet, you have the abrupt thawing of permafrost, you have the coral reef systems, you have the Labrador Sea Current, you have the Barents Sea Ice, which are large systems that are very close to crossing their tipping points. And to close, the latest research even shows that we cannot rule out moving towards major weakness and slowdown of the AMOC, the Atlantic Overturning Circulation System, and even pushing the Amazon rainforest across a tipping point at much lower temperatures than we previously thought, because of the additional pressures posed by breaching the biosphere boundaries. So overall, in closing, we are breaching 7 of the 9 boundaries, and we see signs of reducing resilience in the Earth system, which puts us at even higher risk due to the climate crisis we're facing.
Thanks a lot. It's really striking how what you explained, and yes, as you say, while we are pushing the boundaries of the planet, we are also decreasing the resilience of the ecosystem. So I believe this will have another negative feedback on the system, as you have explained. And now I would like to switch to Mr. Gönül, and I would like to begin our discussion on the energy transition. According to Irena, Mr. Gönül, how does renewable energy and energy transition landscape look like? What do you think the national and international technical, regulatory, and policy frameworks essential to ensuring system reliability and flexibility, and to facilitate cross-border interconnections and clean energy trade? Please, Mr. Gönül.
Thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure to be part of this dialogue, especially as an event organized by METU. As you mentioned, I'm a graduate of METU, and it's really a great pleasure to be together and discuss this important topic of energy transition in the context of COP31. When we talk about energy transition, I thought it is important to first talk about the latest energy crisis and what we have learned from it, as it has clear implications on energy transition. One thing that we learned in a hard way, I would say, that energy systems built on fossil fuels are fundamentally vulnerable. But we have also seen that not every country has been affected at the same level from the crisis. Obviously, their ability to absorb supply disruptions and price shocks is a factor. But what we also witnessed that those countries with higher shares of renewables in their system had lower electricity prices during the crisis, like Portugal, like Spain, like Nordic countries. So that was a clear indication that we have seen. One thing also we have learned from the crisis is that energy security is no longer just about stockpiling fuels. It is increasingly about countries' ability to build resilient energy systems. And today, I believe renewables offer the most competitive, most affordable, reliable, and sustainable path in achieving this. This tells us, in fact, renewables are no longer only about climate. It is equally about energy security. It is equally about economic competitiveness and affordability of the countries. Those countries running their economy with larger shares of renewables will definitely have economic competitiveness, stronger economic competitiveness compared to other countries, but also the socioeconomic development impact of energy transition. I think these are all important elements of why we should shift to energy transition and to renewables. Last year was another record year for renewables, 692 gigawatts of renewable capacity added. And it's the largest annual increase ever. By the end of last year, I think close to half of the global installed capacity is now with renewables. With annual power additions, 85% comes from renewables. So I think renewables are mainstream now. But I think there has been a very important groundbreaking development very late recently, is that now renewables can offer electricity 24/7 around the clock. Because for years, we have been told that solar and wind are too variable to power our grids. But now evidence shows that when we combine solar and wind with battery storage, with smarter grids and flexible demand, we can deliver reliable electricity day and night, often at a lower cost than fossil fuel-based systems. We see today firm solar plus storage available at as low as 54 cents per kilowatt hour. I don't know if number makes any sense to you, but it is really competitive. I mean, just to compare it, coal-based power is around 70 to 80 cents today, and gas power is 100 cents. So renewables, solar and wind can provide firm capacity. I think that is a very important point. System flexibility is the keyword here. We no longer speak about base load, but achieving the highest level of overall system flexibility across different segments of the supply chain, from generation point to consumption point. And flexibility is not only about your generation mix, but it's also how you shave your peaks in your demand curve, how you strategically place storage across your system, and run your system optimally with the help of digitalization and AI. Interconnections play an essential role because you don't have to really build expensive batteries to store every excess kilowatt hour. But part of the balancing can be achieved through transmission infrastructure by sharing resources across much larger geographic areas, benefiting from, for instance, solar production peaks at different time zones or variations in wind conditions across different regions, differing demand patterns between industrial centers and residential areas. These are all opportunities that we can tap into to be able to achieve higher level of flexibility in our system. So I think stronger transmission network and cross-border interconnections will definitely help preventing curtailments.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Gönül. This was really enlightening. You have very clearly explained the state of renewable energy. We will, in the next round, we will come to its limitations as well. But now I would like to ask Dr. Newell about the transition away from fossil fuels, that it's being the big challenge, both for politically and technically. So let's start with politics. The proposal for fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty that you also helped to develop, it aimed to complement the Paris Agreement to stop new coal, oil, and gas production projects and phase out fossil fuel extraction. Our speakers in the first webinar had pointed out, or some of them had pointed out, that maybe the time is not right to get completely away from fossil fuels and phase it out at COP31. Do you agree with this assessment, and how do you think the fossil fuel treaty could deliver in the current global political climate? What they can deliver in the current global climate that there is more tendency towards fossil fuels? Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you all today. Yeah, obviously, I don't agree with the idea that we shouldn't be having this conversation now. I realize it's a very difficult conversation about how to transition away from a global energy system, which is still quite heavily dependent on fossil fuels, notwithstanding the comments we just heard from our colleague from IRENA about the speed and scale of the transition towards renewable energy. But it seems strange also to me to delay a discussion of fossil fuel phase out at a time when literally, I'm sitting in Europe, but in many parts of the world is literally on fire as a result of burning of fossil fuels. So if the suggestion is now's not a good time to be having this conversation, I guess I would ask, when is? And I guess some of us that have been pushing this idea of a fossil treaty, much of that momentum was born of the fact we had over 30 years of climate change negotiations through the UNFCCC in Paris and so on, which failed to address the primary driver of the climate crisis in fossil fuels. And the fact is, unless we get a grip on that issue and start to actively reduce the production of fossil fuels, we're not going to get a grip on this problem. And of course, the costs of adaptation will continue to rise exponentially over time unless we do so. So for those saying, this isn't the right time for this conversation, I guess I would ask them to focus very much on the costs of inaction in terms of, the costs of lives, of property, of the things that we're seeing all around the world right now, and to ask them whether they're willing to pay for those costs. So I think really we need to push back strongly on the idea that now's not a good time to be talking about reducing fossil fuels. And I think also, despite the difficulties and the geopolitical moment that we're in, momentum is finally there, even within the UNFCCC negotiations. More than 80 countries supported fossil fuel phase-out language at COP28. 86 countries at COP30 in Belém supported a roadmap for phasing out fossil fuels. And just early this year in Santa Marta in Colombia, we saw this first summit on transitioning away from fossil fuels, which has set up a parallel process, very much born of a frustration with the lack of attention to this issue so far. And I think that was a surprising success. It brought together countries representing more than 1/3 of global fossil fuel consumption, 1/5 of global production, and even major fossil fuel producers such as Canada, Australia, Nigeria. They were all there and they were having this difficult conversation. So I think we can't ignore that momentum and the way things are moving. And if you look at the report that came out of the Santa Marta conference, 80% of the sectors that were contributing to those conversations were calling for a new international mechanism to support an equitable and just fossil fuel phase out. And many governments in their interventions from Ghana to Malawi, plus the 18 governments that already support the fossil fuel treaty idea, were calling for something like this. And the report very much put emphasis on the need to strengthen existing and address existing governance and implementation gaps through new mechanisms, incentives, agreements, and so on. And so I think what a fossil fuel treaty could deliver is a really more rules-based, principle-based, more managed, more orderly exit from fossil fuels. Because I guess the alternative is what we're seeing at the moment, where you're having this slightly chaotic, disruptive, violent, nationally driven set of transitions, which tending to leave workers, regions, and assets left behind. So my preference would be for a more multilateral attempt to try and deal with the very many difficult issues of transitioning away from fossil fuels. And such an agreement would also provide space to have those other more difficult conversations around things like levels of indebtedness that countries are facing, or the need to address trade rules and how to support economic diversification, because those are issues that are not getting sufficient airtime and attention in the existing UN climate negotiations. And I think the treaty offers one way of trying to move those things forward. So I think the roadmaps that countries are developing at the moment are really important, but there's potentially a big disconnect there between the scale and the jurisdiction of what national governments can do and have direct oversight of, and the globally interconnected and integrated nature of the energy system in terms of energy production and finance and infrastructures and ownership. And it's there, I think, we need a more global approach to the question.
Thanks a lot. You have given a very clear message about that it's the time to phase out from fossil fuels, and we will also come to the technicalities and the technical challenges behind it. And with that, I would like to move to Professor Rochbrom. And Professor, I believe you would agree with me that energy transition, where from a technical or political standpoint, should not be considered or handled alone, but it's a component, as a component from a nexus perspective. So in your opinion, how we can rapidly scale the global energy transition without pushing other planetary boundaries? We know that this transition requires other natural resources, such as freshwater use, land system change. It affects the biosphere integrity and certain need for certain minerals. So utilizing these other resources, would that affect the planetary boundaries beyond their safe operating limits? Please.
Yeah, thanks. And let me start to answer that question, start by just lending my full support to Peter Newell's intervention here earlier, which I think sets in the context, Boris, your question, which is that it is, of course, absolutely clear, just like Gorbos points out, that we have a very positive, actually exponential rise in renewable energy across large tracts of markets across the world, even in the global south. And this is happening not primarily because of climate policy, but because it is clean, it is cheaper, it's more effective, and it provides more energy independence and resilience from domestic households to communities, to cities, to regions. So this is, you know, a strategic, clever strategy to move towards the future. But that said, we also need to recognize that we need to accelerate the phase out of fossil fuels. And there's no negotiations with that because the costs of failing on that transition are clearly much, much larger than the costs of the transition. And once the transition is through, we have ample evidence today that in the other side, we come out with more energy independent, more resilient, more competitive, and more future-oriented modern economies, given that we're moving towards a more digitalized, electric-driven global economy. So in that sense, I would say it's clear that we have to address heads-on your challenge. How do we ensure that this transition away from fossil fuels, which by the way has already started, and there's no return from that point. The question is not whether we're phasing out fossil fuels. The question is, are we doing it fast enough? And so far, we are going much too slow. So then the question is, how do we ensure that this transition occurs without undermining the other planetary boundaries? So biodiversity, minerals affecting land systems, forest systems, all forms of mining, freshwater use, agricultural, food security. And I would say that in our scenarios, we are running one of the big integrated assessment models here at the Potsdam Institute. I would argue that we have today, as we meet today, the most optimistic overshoot scenario, meaning a scenario that limits overshoot to 1.7 degrees Celsius of peak warming, which by the way means that it will get worse before it gets better. So what we've experienced this summer with over 10,000 premature deaths because of over 40 degrees Celsius of life-threatening heat in Europe, and all the fires and the droughts and the El Nino human amplified El Nino impacts on floods and droughts that we are still to see around the world, occurs on a 1.4 degrees Celsius planet. So it will get worse before it potentially gets better. But the scenarios we've run show that it can get better. We can come back to 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of this century with known technologies that can be scaled under current economic and policy regimes without undermining the key biodiversity, land system, freshwater boundaries. And how do we do that? Well, it's about resource efficiency, it's about closing cycles, it's about recognizing that wind and solar are the most promising renewable energy systems. And of course, Gurbus Gonal can confirm this, and that this can be planned in ways that does not undermine intact nature or food security systems. And let me just close by reminding us that that is why this is a systematic transition. We know that apart from the energy transition, the second most important transformation is the food system transition. And the food system transition is fundamental also for climate because it adds up to 30% of the global greenhouse gas emissions, but it's also the primary factor determining whether or not we have intact nature, biodiversity, land, and water on the safe side of the boundaries. Now, if we transition towards sustainable, healthy food, we release pressure on the agricultural system and can free up pressure for some of the transition requirements towards more renewable, fossil fuel-free energy systems. So we're talking about an accounting system, and the planetary boundary framework, I would argue, provides an accounting system to be able to stay within the safe boundaries for this transition away from fossil fuels, but also to scale renewable energy systems.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, okay. You have clearly stated that we need to move, that we need to phase out from fossil fuels, and we are doing it. And the question is how fast we are doing it, and yeah, a better, more sustainable future is possible. And it was quite interesting what you said about food systems transition, which I fully agree, which is also in a way in our hands, because our choices, preferences about food that we consume may matter a lot. So I think this is a very critical issue as well that we all need to think and consider. And with this, actually, I would like to come back to Dr. Newell, because in your work, Dr. Nurul, you worked on the political economy of low carbon transitions, and you have examined how bigger powers and fossil fuel interests can stall this structural change. So what do you think? How do you think COPs can overcome this resistance?
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's a very good question, and it's worth saying, that resistance has been strong and very effective for a very, very long time, which is part of the reason we're in this situation. Some of it, I guess, is to do with the voting rules and the fact that the voting rules were never properly agreed in the climate regime, which means by default, absolute consensus has to be achieved. And what that means in practice, of course, is that one or two countries or a small block of countries can easily and frequently do block progress on action. And that's particularly been with respect to discussions of fossil fuels, which OPEC countries and other large oil producing countries in particular have sought to veto and dilute over the course of the last few decades. And again, that's precisely why some countries at least decided they'd had enough and wanted to initiate a Santa Marta process to take this discussion forward in a format and an environment where that veto power was no longer there. But I guess it relates to a second issue, and other institutions have had policies like this in place where you have a conflict of interest policy. So the World Health Organization, for example, when it was negotiating a treaty on tobacco control, had very strong restrictions on the ability of tobacco companies to participate and shape the rules when there was an obvious conflict of interest and a conflict with the overall goals of the agreement, in that case to protect public health. And in this case, when we're talking about fossil fuel companies participating heavily in the negotiations, often sitting on government delegations, and so getting access to private discussions on these issues, but who have a conflict of interest because they don't share that same aim, of course, of accelerating climate action and moving beyond fossil fuels, but rather want to keep exploiting as many fossil fuels as possible. So I think there is a growing demand and chorus of opinion for a conflict of interest policy. That would be another way of trying to deal with that. But I think it's also, at the end of the day, it's an issue of power and representation. And I do think we need greater participation and to hear the voices far more so than we have done previously of those groups which are negatively affected by the failure to transition away from fossil fuels. And I'm thinking, of course, of poorer, younger, more vulnerable, often indigenous populations who are very poorly represented in these processes. But they're the ones very much on the front line of the climate crisis and on the front line of extraction of fossil fuels. So we need to hear the voices much more of those actors that are most negatively affected by inaction and that have the most to gain from further action, accelerated ambition on these issues. And then, the final part of your question there was about what strategies have been effective at trying to accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels. I'm part of a project called SUSPOL, which refers to supply side climate policies. And these are really policies to try and leave fossil fuels in the ground. And interestingly, despite the geopolitical situation we've been talking around, a number of countries, and we have a policy tracker looking at this, have been adopting these sorts of policies. And some of them go back a very long way. So countries like Costa Rica, as far back as 2002, had a moratorium on new oil and gas exploration. Other countries included that we've been studying include the UK and Denmark and Colombia and Chile, Ecuador, each for different reasons. Sometimes it's because the most profitable reserves are already in decline, and so it's better to set a sort of an end date, if you like. In other instances, it's because fossil fuel extraction is incompatible with other things the country is trying to do. So in the case of Costa Rica, it relies a lot on ecotourism revenue. It's very rich in biodiversity, as you know, and therefore it would be incompatible with large-scale exploration of oil and gas. In other contexts, like Ecuador, there was a demand to leave oil reserves in the ground coming very much from indigenous and social movements, and there was a national referendum there. So the dynamics are slightly different in each context. In the case of Chile's coal transition, again, it was partly foreign firms that were just seeing the remaining reserves of coal as unprofitable and likely to be stranded, and therefore they were in favour of an accelerated phase-out timetable. So one of the things we've been doing in that project is precisely looking at those dynamics. And we do that because ultimately all countries that still rely heavily on fossil fuels will have to move further in that direction. So it's worth really trying to understand which policies can work, when, why, and for whom.
Thanks a lot. And I would like to turn to Mr. Gönül. And so if we go back to the technical issues at stake, at COP28, the world agreed to triple global renewable energy capacity by 2030. And Turkey is preparing to launch 35% electrification target by 2035 at COP31. So is the infrastructure ready to accommodate such significant electrification expansion, at least here in Turkey? Because as I understand from you, at the global, we have a big capacity, but this changes regionally. So, and if we combine this with political facilitation from Irena's perspective, what do you say? Please.
Thank you. In fact, I would like to connect this with the earlier conversation on transitioning away from fossil fuels, because we have provided a dedicated report on transitioning away from fossil fuels, which is, in fact, suggesting electrification and grids as the major action areas to be able to achieve transition away from fossil fuels. And we submitted that report to Santa Marta discussions. In fact, when we look at the renewable energy development or pushing renewables and transitioning away from fossil fuels, they look like two sides of the same coin. But political implications are completely different. When you talk with the countries that to push for renewables, everybody is for it. But when you have a conversation for transitioning away from fossil fuels, in fact, when you push renewables, you will automatically push out fossil fuels from the system. But it turns into a completely different conversation politically. So I think this distinction is extremely important, because the implications will be different for different countries when you talk about transitioning away from fossil fuels versus having renewables, more renewables in your system. A lot of buzz around electrification lately, because there's a point on that it's an essential component of energy transition. When you talk renewables and electrification, I think they can enable 75% of emission reductions needed. It's not only about today how much clean electricity we can generate with renewables, but also how much of the economy we can electrify. So transport, industry, heating, cooling, all together, this demand accounts for around 90% of the overall demand. And electrification with renewables is the most viable solution to transition these end-use sectors. And you mentioned about the 35 by 35. So it is 35% renewable electrification by 2035. That is also an ambition that COP31 presidency set for this year. And this, in fact, comes from IRENA's analysis, 35% by 2035 and 50% by over 50% by 2050. We work very closely with the COP31 presidency and how we can take it forward, whether in the form of a pledge or can be taken to the negotiating process. It is up to them. But we have been closely working with the presidency on that topic. Your question on if infrastructure is ready to accommodate such significant electrification expansion, the simple answer is no. The grids are today one of the most important bottlenecks for renewable deployment. Today, around 3,000 gigawatts of renewable energy projects are stranded, awaiting grid connection. And we have created at IRENA an industry platform to specifically address this issue. This is called UNESA, Utilities for Net Zero Alliance. We brought together utilities from across the globe and specifically look into the grid challenge and enable system transformation. What they tell us that we need transmission cables by 2030 that is sufficient to travel the global twice. So there's a huge demand, huge expansion and need for cables. But what we see recently in the last 5-6 years is that cable prices have nearly doubled. And HVDC manufacturing slots are booked years ahead. And I think the supply chains are already giving alarm for long. And the investment into supply chains have dropped around 20% in the last 10 years. And it's not only the cables, it is transformers. In certain regions, it is more than 2.5 years you have to wait to be able to get your transformers. For converters, HVDC subsea cables, in certain regions, it is 4 to 8 years you have to wait. And all this AI and data centers are putting an extra pressure on supply chains and the power system that we need to develop. What can we do at COPs? I think that's one of the questions that you asked. And in fact, COPs are the right place to make political commitments, to increase ambition. The tougher part is to translate these ambitions into concrete actions on the ground. And to be able to do that, we need industry. And how much industry is represented at COPs? And how I think it's extremely important to integrate industry better into the COP process. They are the ones that are expected to take action on the ground. And that's how we do it with industry platforms. We create, like, as I mentioned, UNESA, another one for industry decarbonization that we have created. And we try to give them space, roundtables and high-level events, meet them, bring them together with decision makers. That is something that we always push at the COP process.
Thank you. Thank you. I believe, industry together with innovations that they would bring will be critical to overcome these bottlenecks, and I hope that will be faster than anticipated. And I would like to turn to Professor Rector. And I would like to ask you now, we have been talking about political aspects, political targets, technical aspects, and the negotiations at UNFCCC, they mostly focus on political targets, right? But do you think there would be a way in which we can ensure a shift from negotiation on what is politically acceptable to a joint action on non-negotiable physical thresholds across all planetary boundaries? Can we agree on this in COPs, in the future COP?
Yeah, I mean, that's a wonderful question. And of course, I would argue quite strongly that that's exactly what science shows is necessary. Is the COP configured to deliver on that? Well, I think Gurbuz Gonol in a way already replied that the answer is no. We have a very weak governance structure of the UNFCCC with a consensus-based understanding. It's not even a formalized decision. There's nothing in the statutes that says that we need to have consensus-based decision making. Actually, the article in the statutes were never decided upon. The countries could not agree what kind of majority structure should be used for voting, which is quite remarkable given that other UN conventions have majority voting. So the UNFCCC singles out as a very exception. And this has paralyzed the negotiations for decades, particularly because there are so many actors that have been misusing this open, democratic, transparent, consensus-based exchange in the debates as a way of impeding any kind of progress. That is why I, together with Sandrine Dixon de Cleyre, president of the Club of Rome, 3 years back wrote a letter to Simon Steele, the Director General of the United Nations Framework Convention, arguing quite strongly that we should celebrate. And we should celebrate that now, more than 10 years after signing the Paris Agreement, we should celebrate that we do not need more negotiations. We've actually finalized all the commitments, all the text, all the articles. They're not perfect. I have strong views on many of them, but we don't need to fight anymore over incremental, side parts of the agreement. What we need to do now is instead to say that now is the time to deliver. So the action agenda, which actually the Turkish presidency is emphasizing very strongly, and that was very strongly emphasized also in Belém at COP30 through the 2 roadmaps of halting deforestation and transitioning away from fossil fuels, that is what we now need. The action agenda needs to move forward to deliver. and we are running out of time. We know that we need to cut emissions by roughly 5% per year from 2026 onwards to have any chance of holding and minimizing the overshoot. So now is the time to move into delivery zone. And of course, I would have wished that there was an understanding of non-negotiable scientific guardrails or boundaries like the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit. Political leaders tend to look at this as if it's negotiable, which they're not. These are physical, and despite the scientific uncertainties, we take big risks if we breach them. So I'm not so optimistic. That is why, to close, I see that initiatives like the Santa Marta process and efforts of creating coalitions of countries that can move forward more rapidly on a sustainable, fossil fuel free and resource efficient pathway, scaling renewable energy, electrifying, just has been discussed here earlier, is at least a plan B that can succeed. Why? Because of the evidence that we know that once you've invested and start scaling the decarbonized, sustainable energy and biosphere management systems, you have a very high chance of being winner in terms of security, in terms of economic development, in terms of competitiveness, but also in terms of health and stability. And that is, of course, a recipe for being able to influence also the broader debates at the COP meetings. So one should not underestimate what it means to have these coalitions of the willing, but they need to report back properly into the plenary of the COP process.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. And many questions are coming on these issues, which I will continue at the end. But now I would like to turn our attention to Global South in particular. So, Dr. Newell, when we consider developing countries or emerging economies, maybe we can say that it's a bigger challenge for them, for these middle power nations like Turkey and Brazil, which are this year's and previous COP hosts. How can they navigate the trade pressures and border carbon adjustment mechanism imposed by larger economic blocs while trying to build their own domestic low carbon industries? I know this is a hard question, but I guess you are the right person. If someone can answer this question, that will be you.
Thank you. Well, let's see. That's a lot of pressure. Yes, it is a very big question. Yeah, I mean, look, it's very, very hard, but I think the direction of travel is clear. I mean, you highlighted in your question there the carbon border adjustment mechanism of the EU, but I guess I would see that as just one of very many drivers, if you like, or incentives to decarbonize economies and diversify away from fossil fuels. And I think the incentives are growing stronger, not just on the sort of positive side that we've heard from our colleague from Irina, but also the fear of being left behind ultimately, that regions, countries, workers, communities will be left with stranded assets, stranded communities, stranded workforces, so that there's a sense of being left behind unless countries can try and move. So there are these pressures clearly coming from the EU and from other countries, but I think there's also an opportunity there. And clearly it's the case that demand for fossil fuels, because of the processes of electrification that we've been talking about, will be falling. And I think it's really important. This is where the sort of north-south dimension comes in. It is really important to support economies and regions that are particularly dependent on fossil fuels, for tax revenues and for funding development programs, to help them diversify, so that they're not left behind. In other words, financial support of various forms for economic diversification. And I think that's vital globally to sustaining support for fossil fuel phase out, because unless we deal with some of those justice questions and issues of social inclusion, then we will get backlash, which is the sort of thing we're seeing around the world at the moment. So it's very, very important to bring communities with us that might otherwise feel left behind. But I think also, just to underscore the opportunity that comes with this, although it's sometimes perceived as a threat to some developing countries, there are also, economic savings, if you think also about the redirection of fossil fuel subsidies, which I think the IMF still suggests stand at around $1 million every single minute, still being spent on fossil fuel subsidies. So subsidizing the problem that we're trying to address. And imagine what you could do if that money was redirected towards supporting economies to build out renewables and to sort of build more resilient energy systems of one sort or another. So there's clearly financial savings and opportunities there, as well as reduced health costs, and as well as, of course, boosting resilience and energy independence, as the other speakers have emphasized. I think from a more political economy point of view, a key challenge is protecting countries' policy space, which is a term people like me, political economists, use to describe the autonomy that governments should have to use a range of industrial policy instruments, such as tariffs or infant industry protection or subsidies or looser forms of intellectual property rights to try and build out their own domestic industries so that they're not left behind in this move towards electrification and trying to transition away from fossil fuels. But there will have to be some reforms at higher level in terms of trade rules and trade policies and dealing with things like investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms, which are being currently used to punish countries that are moving further in this direction. So I think there's a whole range of things that can be done there to really capitalize on the opportunities that this transition presents.
Thanks a lot. I would like to continue in the same track, actually, and ask Mr. Gönül. One of the major issues around energy transition is that developing nations often struggle to convert their NDCs into bankable projects. So how do you think multilateral organizations can help governments mitigate political and economic risks to attract private infrastructure capital? What more can be done in terms of improving clean energy investments in developing countries?
In developing countries, what we see is a systemic barrier to energy transition. And markets in many countries in the developing world are designed around fossil fuels. Grids are neither interconnected nor flexible enough to absorb high shares of solar and wind. And current level of institutional capacity are insufficient to plan, implement, even operate the energy systems of the future. And we see clear disparities, regional disparities in investment flows. And for instance, Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, receiving only 2% of energy transition investments is not acceptable. There must be something wrong with the existing mechanisms. It is not about their lack of ambition, but there's the ability to deploy larger shares of renewables. And I think definitely there is something that needs to be done. Obviously, they have unique hurdles and vulnerabilities. They have, under the pressure of high debt burden in many instances, financing is costly, and their financial markets are not well developed. These are all factors, but still it doesn't justify the low level of ambition. And if you are talking about the real global, fair, and inclusive energy transition, and this situation cannot continue like this. The energy transition priorities, I think it's important that those are embedded into the global financial frameworks to be able to capture those specificities more clearly. I think there's a role for public finance, and we need to use those scarce resources strategically and wisely. And obviously, they are essential to leverage and de-risk private sector investment. It's a catalyzer of private investors. But public investments or public funds are equally needed for supporting development of emerging technologies, for instance, in energy transition. They are equally needed for making the energy transition fair and inclusive. And fair and inclusive energy transition, it doesn't take place automatically. There's a cost for it. And somebody has to pay for it. And the public funds are well placed also to be able to address those costs. So I think each country has to make its calculation clearly, and how those public funds, either coming from domestic market or coming from international mechanisms, that how those public funds can be used wisely. I think one aspect of which is coming repeatedly, coming up into our discussions, is the project bankability. You also mentioned it. And for what is project bankability? I mean, there is no single definition for it. Financing institutions link it to the confidence level they are prepared to move forward with the project. So, and which can vary from one project to another. But there are certain cases, projects may not be commercially attractive, may not be bankable. And then financing and policies, in our view, in Irina's view, must work to shift the focus from narrow financial bankability criteria to an approach that values all potential positive impact and externalities. And in project decisions, no consideration is given to environmental externalities, no care for health externalities. These are not captured by bankability. So this, I think this overall logic may need to be adjusted for certain cases. Access to finance is another issue. And when you talk to investors and banks, there's plenty of finance available as long as your projects are bankable. But at what cost? I think the cost of financing is especially important. By risk mitigation instruments that you can lower it and bring together public and private players and then develop and context-specific financing and business models. Blended finance is important to provide, especially for project preparation, technical assistance for guaranteed products, etc. But one important dimension is the climate finance. And climate finance, when you talk about, obviously, GCF adaptation fund at one place, where we're talking about complicated application procedures, lengthy process to receive the funds, and which eventually leading to limited access to finance, especially in the least developed countries. Access to climate finance is extremely limited. But also, what is climate finance for? Is it only for renewables? Also for grids, for instance? The climate taxonomy is extremely important in that, because what we see is today more than 60% of grids, which are absolutely needed to be able to develop your renewable energy capacity and integrate more renewables into your systems, they remain ineligible to climate finance under the current taxonomy. And this is one of the areas that we are trying to take action. We are working with GGI, Global Grid Initiative, and UNESA, Utilities for Net Zero Alliance. They developed a new climate finance principles that provide a practical way to unlock investments by assessing grid projects based on their clean energy transition ability, not only for their emission profile. And those GGI and UNESA, they wrote letters to MDBs, financial institutions, to agree on a climate finance terminology that will enable climate financing of grid investments also.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Gönül. While I have you here, I will continue with you. We have completed the round of questions within 1 hour, which is perfect, but I would like to keep you for another 5 to 10 minutes because this is really exciting. And the last question, actually, I was going to continue with Mr. Gönül. To all the speakers, if you would pick one single achievement that would come out of COP31 in Turkey, what should this be, Mr. Gönül? And then there are some questions from the audience, and I will ask you that too, and continue with Professor Rockstrom and Dr. Neville.
Okay, I'll take the question from the energy transition angle, obviously.
Yes.
And definitely, I mean, this year, the flavor of the conference is electrification. My expectation is that preferably, as we had it at COP28, what we had at COP28 is political strong commitment for tripling renewables, doubling energy efficiency. And that was not even part of the action agenda. That was part of the how they call it, UAE consensus, which is the concluding document of COP28. So that provided a very strong political signal and the guidance to member countries to move forward and strongly moving forward in renewables. I would expect and same level of strong engagement and political commitment for electrification, around 35. If we are able to bring as many countries as possible around it, then IRENA is prepared to push it forward in after COP process. It is always extremely important for that kind of commitments to have an institution which will take it forward after the COP. We see, you see tens, but sometimes hundreds of different sort of commitments coming out of COPs, and 2 years after, 80% disappear. The reason is basically there is no specific institution who is following up and who is pushing for that. And that's the offer we have made to also the COP31 presidency. IRENA is prepared to take it forward, as we are doing still for COP28 outcomes. We are annually tracking the implementation of tripling renewables and doubling efficiency goals. We are prepared to do it also for electrification.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. And one interesting question for you, Mr. Gönül, from the audience. While artificial intelligence drives massive new energy demands, it simultaneously offers advanced tools for grid optimization. Given this dual impact, how do you see its role shaping the global energy transition ahead of COP31?
That's a very good question, and that's really one dimension I'm also very curious about, because I haven't seen any analysis showing us that. On the one hand, we all talk about this huge additional power demand that's coming from data centers, right? But we haven't heard some sort of comparison. On the one side, this much is extra energy demand is needed, but with application of AI into optimization of energy systems, how much gain I'm going to get out of this in terms of capacity, investment, etc. I haven't seen any report, any analysis making that kind of comparison. What we hear is to be able to enable AI, we need more electricity. That's putting more pressure on the grid, on the power systems, and putting us in trouble. But this ability to create that sort of huge level of optimization, I haven't seen it yet.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. And now I'd like to switch to Professor Rockstrom. Professor, how would you pick one achievement that you would expect out of COP31? How would you frame it in 1 or 2 sentences?
I think that the number one part is to recognize, I mean, if the COP meeting overall can agree that we should move into delivery mode, so to say that now is the time to draw a line. We need to share solutions. We need to find financial mechanisms. We need to have a fair and equitable way of enabling those who are most severely affected by climate change to also transition in the mitigation pathway. We need to secure that we fulfill all the commitments we have on adaptation, on loss and damage. Basically start delivering everything we've promised over the past 10 years of COP meetings, and in particular take on heads-on this question of electrification, which is the top priority for COP31 that the Turkish presidency has identified, but do it in a way that I feel that this conversation here today addresses it, namely that it has to form as an integral part of the overall energy transition. So it's about electrifying, yes, it's about finding sustainable renewable energy transitions, solutions that can scale within the planetary boundaries, and it's about accelerating or transitioning away from fossil fuels. It's one integrated agenda, and if the COP31 won't be able to resolve all of this, but if at least we can turn a corner and really continue working along the lines that were set in motion by André Correa do Lago, Anna Toni, and the whole COP30 team, and which was emphasized in the Santa Marta process, to really find ways of moving along this transition pathway. And to do that, I think the world needs to be reminded of the tremendous risks we're facing if we do not take this on seriously now. Because the trick is that we are seeing the costs and the irreversible changes hitting much, much faster than we had expected. It's moving faster in the wrong direction than we had expected, which means that what the COP meetings need to do is to be basically reconsidering its own risk assessment and act accordingly.
Thank you. And the audience is curious about how, if you can elaborate the connection between global tipping points and resilience efforts, and how and if countries build adaptation and resilience capacity under current trends.
You know, the global tipping point systems are hardwired in the Earth system, so you cannot negotiate with them. They have their own chemical, biological, and physical points. So the Greenland ice sheet will, at a certain level of forcing, simply cross over its threshold from being a net stable ice cooling system to becoming a net self-amplifying melted and warming system. Same with the Amazon rainforest, same with the AMOC, same with the coral reef system, same with the permafrost, same with the West Antarctic ice sheet. They have hard, sharp thresholds. The only reason why we cannot give exact points where those thresholds are is that science is not there yet. We don't have the level of precision. That's why we have uncertainty, and that's why this is a risk question. So there is very little of negotiation, and therefore very little of let's say, ability for us to invest in efforts that can reduce the risk of crossing thresholds if we continue on the pathway of undermining the stability of the system by continuing emitting greenhouse gases and continuing to breach the biosphere boundaries. So the only answer on a resilient building pathway is a mitigation pathway. It is reducing the pressure, reducing what is causing this, which are the greenhouse gas emissions, and of course investing in securing particularly biodiversity and intact nature. We have ample evidence that diverse, stable, large biomes or ecosystems are much, much better able to handle shocks and stress than monocultures and big, look at just the forest systems in Europe now. The monoculture systems of spruce and pine are much, much more sensitive to risks of not only burning down, but when they burn in a much more severe way than diverse, natural, old-growth forest, as one example. So you can build resilience, but again, you cannot fend away the risk of crossing tipping points unless you reduce the pressures. When it comes to adaptation, there's a lot that can be done and a lot that must be done. We're moving into a point where temperate regions in the world will have to invest in public sector cooling systems, which they've never needed before. Can you imagine? European farmers need to learn from semi-arid African farmers how to build water harvesting systems to buffer droughts and dry spells, which have never been a problem in temperate agriculture, but now is becoming rapidly a problem. So of course you can have adaptive investments, but these are expensive, and these are ways of unfortunately many times being misused as just pushing the responsibility of mitigation forward, because they give this artificial impression that we are able to handle the temperature rise. But in reality, we're just placing ourselves in a more and more costly and more vulnerable position. But they are necessary.
Okay, thank you. Another quick question, if I may. The audience is asking the effect of the recent energy transition on the planetary boundaries, if this is assessed, or if you can say something on that. I guess maybe through models, the impact on planetary boundaries is assessed.
No, Well, I should say that that remains a research question to assess across all the planetary boundaries the impacts of really scaling fossil fuel-free energy systems. So far, we don't see any evidence of large-scale impacts on transitioning into renewable energy systems, but we have indications of concern. And the major indications of concern are on rare earth metals and the way mining occurs, and on fresh water. But this is, I would argue, areas that can be managed in a responsible way if we address them already in the design phase of the technology development. Take, for example, battery technology. If you take the most recent industrial efforts of developing battery technology for transport, for cars and trucks, the efforts are to have recycling with up to 95% or 95% or more of the key minerals that are invested in these systems. If you per design have engineering that focuses on circularity, there is of course a very large or a much better chance to handle this transition. But I would say, just as a closing remark, that despite the fact that this is a very serious question, of course, and it's really good that this question is on the table already at the transition phase, it is a very small risk factor compared to what the fossil fuel-based industrial exploitation of ecosystems and impacts on air pollutants and climate change are causing already today. So we're moving essentially from a system which is, let's say, 100% bad into a system that indeed has challenges, but already at the outset has many magnitudes better or results in terms of impacts. So it's not an argument for staying on fossil fuels. It's rather an argument for being very proud that we already in the design phase know that we have multiple parameters that we need to meet already at the outset, not wakening up in downstream sometime in the future when we've caused major environmental impacts.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, Professor. And I would like to switch to Dr. Newell with a follow-up question, or at least I consider it as a follow-up question from the audience. But again, a hard one, sorry about that. The energy transition reduces dependence on fossil fuels, but at the same time, it creates new dependencies on critical minerals, clean technology, and maybe limited manufacturing countries. So how can states manage these emerging dependencies without replacing one form of strategic vulnerability with another?
Yeah, in a way, it goes back to what I was saying before about the importance of green industrial policy and countries trying to navigate this transition on their own terms in ways which can capture benefits. And that does mean using a whole gamut of different trade industrial strategies. And that, there are real dangers, I think, associated with the critical minerals boom, and there's questions around governing that properly. For me, I guess it comes back to the classic thing about cutting with both arms of the scissors, as people sometimes say. We can't just assume that energy demand of whichever sort is just going to keep increasing. We have to cut energy demand and use it more efficiently and so on. And think about shifts in overall systems. So it's not just about replacing every single oil or diesel car on the road with an electric one. It's about moving towards more public forms of transportation. So there's fewer individual vehicles on the road, etc. So it's about shifting some of those systems and reducing demand, because clearly we can't go for endless, another boom of critical minerals. But I think, as Gur was saying earlier as well, there are these huge increases and leaps of innovation, I think, around around storage technologies and batteries, which are requiring few inputs and fewer minerals. So you just have to make sure the incentives are strongly there to move further in that direction. But there will need to be shifts in how we think about trade and investment policies in this area to make sure that those countries are not left behind. As Gul was mentioned before, that sub-Saharan African countries really not benefiting yet from the flows of finance in this area. So we do need to rethink risk assessments and risk thresholds and what we mean by a bankable project and the things he was pointing to. And it does mean richer countries giving poorer countries, developing countries, a bit more policy space to use some of these policy tools, which they themselves used to industrialize in the first place, to allow them to build up, infant industry protection and all these sorts of measures to try and build out a competitive renewable energy base.
Thank you. And lastly, I would like to also ask you about the one single achievement that you would expect from the upcoming COP.
Yeah, I think I'd very much agree with what the previous speaker said. I would just perhaps put it in a slightly different way, in that I see the drive towards electrification and support to renewables as absolutely critical, but it won't be enough unless we're also at the same time talking about reducing fossil fuel production. Then we're just going to be adding to the energy mix and not displacing fossil fuels sufficiently. So we do have to keep in this critical conversation about transitioning away from fossil fuel and putting down some limits on fossil fuel production. Otherwise, powerful fossil fuel actors will resist the shift towards electrification and renewables. So that's something I would say we need to address it with, see it as two sides of the same coin, effectively.
Thank you. And with this, I would like to, say a few last words. Again, I would like to thank all our speakers. This was really extremely informative. I learned a lot, and I apologize to our audience if I couldn't ask all the questions, but I will definitely be listening to our speakers again. So this will be on our YouTube channel, METU Climates. Please also follow our social media, as we will have 3 more METU Climate Talks as pre-COP events. And with that, I would like to end towards webinar and thank to everyone who has joined, contributed, and especially to our speakers. Thank you.